There is, as I have noticed in the process of all my traveling around, and perhaps even more in my peregrinations on the internet and the talking to people, reading messages that people post, there's a real proliferation of ideas out there as people, feeling somewhat liberated from the constraints of the past, want to examine everything. And I basically don't have any disagreement with that. I think that if you can prove something once, you can certainly prove it again. And the idea of examining the things that we have been taught, searching the Scriptures daily to see whether things are so, I think is all very well. One of the things that I find a little distressing or disquieting, however, in the whole thing is that all too many people are postulating new ideas when they have not mastered the basics. I've talked about this before, that the fundamentals, like in football, you've got to master blocking and tackling. There's certain things like that that you've got to get nailed down before the finer points of football even mean anything. You can't block, you can't tackle, you can't play football. And so it is when it comes to the question of doing theology, as it were, or doing prophecy, or the many things that people like to study in the Scriptures. It's really critical that a person nail down the basics. Because a great deal of what I am reading these days from people in both theology and doctrine and in prophecy is really what I would call mid-air interpretation. You know, it's attempts to explain all this stuff out here in the middle of nowhere without foundation properly being laid for the things that people are talking about. What I want to talk to you about today in terms of foundation is prophecy. And I think that there is one prophecy in particular, one book in particular, that unless a person nails this down, much of what we look at in prophecy is going to be incomprehensible or uninterpretable. You will not be able to put together any kind of a coherent theme of what's going to happen in the future. I've asked the question, why should God even tell us what's going to happen in the future? And one of the reasons is so that we can change the future, so that we can get out of the way, so that we can flee if we have to, so that we can repent if we must, and so that somehow we can make our personal future different from what it otherwise might have been. That's one of the reasons. The other reason is so that as history plays itself out, we will understand what is going on around us. Now, I have, as I think many of you probably already know, have said that the future does not exist, that the future grows out of the decisions that you and I are making and that God is making day by day. There are, however, prophecies that would, at least on the face of it, seem to go contrary to that. And one of them is found in the 2nd chapter of Daniel. It's a critical prophecy because if whatever scheme of prophecy you put together, whatever sorting out of events in the future toward the end time you're going to encounter, it's got to fit the framework of Daniel 2. And I'll explain to you why that's so as we go along through this very, very important chapter. In the 2nd chapter of Daniel, it says, in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams wherewith his spirit was troubled and his sleep broke from him. And the king commanded to call the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans to show the king his dream. So they came and they stood before the king. And the king said to them, I have dreamed a dream. This is not Martin Luther King's dream. This is Nebuchadnezzar's dream. He said, my spirit was troubled to know the dream. So the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Syriac, or Aramaic, said, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show you the interpretation. Aha. Well, now look, we could start a business of interpretation of dreams, couldn't we? And somebody could come to us and tell us his dream, and for a fee, we could give him an interpretation. But what would that be worth to him? Well, who knows? Some of us might even be right once or twice in the interpretation of a dream. But the point simply is that they said, you tell us the dream, we'll show you the interpretation. And Nebuchadnezzar was nobody's fool. He realized that they could tell him anything. And because, even though this was an emperor, even a man with enormous power, a man who snapped his fingers and everybody in front of him is taken out and shot or hanged or whatever he's going to do with him, even though he has this kind of power, his kingdom is not free of politics. And so the question would then arise, what are the political implications of this dream? And what are the political implications of the interpretation that will come from all these different categories of people in front of him? And if he'd called them in one at a time and isolated them, gotten his interpretations of his dreams, we all know that the dreams would have been interpreted according to whatever particular political idea that the interpreter in question would have brought in. And the king answered and said, now we don't know whether he means this literally or whether he's just putting them their feet to the fire. He said, the thing is gone from me. But he says, if you will not make known to me the dream with the interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces and your houses turned into a dunghill. Now this is pretty extreme. And it almost sounds like Nebuchadnezzar is fed up to here with the Chaldeans and his astrologers and his soothsayers, and he's ready to make a clean sweep of them. And I can kind of halfway understand what might be going on here, in the sense that these people, all of them, would have formed an incredible hotbed of politics and intrigue in the imperial palace, and no excuse to get rid of them all should be overlooked. And so here's an excuse, ready-made to hand, to get rid of them. He said, if you will show me the dream and the interpretation, you will receive of me gifts and rewards and great honor. So show me the dream and give me the interpretation. And they said, well, let the king live for and tell his servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation of it. Again, we can do that. The king answered and said, I know of a certainty you're stalling. You're trying to gain time because you see the thing is gone from me. But if you will not make known to me the dream, there is only one decree for you, for you have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me until the time be changed. Now what that means I couldn't tell you. But something is on the horizon. And these people have already prepared before they even knew there was a dream. Lying and corrupt words to speak before the king. There was an incredible amount of palace intrigue going on here as to what was going to happen. I don't have any question Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. I do have a question as to whether it was really gone from him or not. And I have no question that he really wanted an excuse to make a clean sweep of that entire category of soothsayers and Chaldeans. He said, you've tried this. Therefore, tell me the dream, and then I will know that you can tell me the interpretation of the dream. There the Chaldeans answered the king and said, well, there's not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. There is no king, lord, or ruler that asks such things at any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. And it's a rare thing that the king requires. There is no one that can do this except the gods who don't live among men. For this cause the king was angry. Not only was he angry, he was very furious. And he commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. Here was his chance. Going to wipe them all out. And the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain. And they sought to Daniel and his fellows to be slain, because Daniel was considered a wise man. And so Daniel and the guys that were with him were going to be killed right along with the rest of them. So Daniel answered with wisdom and counsel to the captain of the king's guard, named Arioch, who had gone forth to carry this out. And he said, why is the king so hasty? And Arioch made the thing known to Daniel. So Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time, and he would show the king the interpretation. So Daniel went to his house and made the thing known to his three companions, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. By the way, for your little trivia quizzes, biblical trivia quizzes, watch out for these three names. These are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the three Hebrew children that were thrown in the fiery furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are their Chaldean or their Babylonian names. Their Hebrew names are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He asked them that they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning the secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with all the rest of them. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision, and Daniel blessed the God of heaven. And he answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his, and he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. He reveals the deep secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. I thank you and I praise you, O thou God of my fathers, who has given me wisdom and might, and has made known to me now what we desired of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. Now, up until this point, you might read this and think to yourself, well, that's rather interesting, a vision that's given to the king. But when we come to understand the scope of this vision, of this dream, it becomes rather remarkable the circumstances under which it was given, because the dream, which is about the entire history of one segment, at least of man, from Nebuchadnezzar until the return of Christ, is revealed to this man in a dream. And it's not revealed initially to Daniel or any other prophet of God. It's revealed to Nebuchadnezzar of all people. And I think a person should at least ponder why God would choose to reveal such a momentous thing to such a man, rather than reveal it in the first place to Daniel. I can think of one reason. One is the validation of it. For you have not merely two Hebrew poets, as it were, one having a dream and the other confirming it. You have the most visible and powerful man in the world vouching for the accuracy of the dream and consequently validating Daniel's interpretation. So this thing, it's the equivalent of having the President of the United States, who right now is the most powerful man in the world, vouching for the fact that he had a dream and somebody over here interpreted it. And I would gather that you could pretty well count on the king of Babylon's word on something like this. I know you can count on Daniel's word. So Daniel went to Arioch, and he said, "Don't kill anybody. Take me before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation." So he brought Daniel in haste, and he said to him, "I have found a man of the captives of Judah that will make known to the king the interpretation." And the king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar. That's another biblical trivia question. What was Daniel's Chaldean name, or Babylonian name? He said, "Are you able to make known the dream that I have seen with the interpretation?" And Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, "The secret which the king has commanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers, they cannot show this to the king. But there is a God in heaven that reveals secrets, and makes known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed are these. As for you, O king, your thoughts came into your mind upon your bed. What shall come to pass hereafter?" Before he went to bed, he was lying there in his bed at night saying to himself, "I wonder what the future holds. Where is all this going to lead? How is the intrigue that's going on here at this time going to turn out? What is the future of my kingdom and of the things that are come hereafter?" He said, "He that reveals secrets makes known to you what is going to come to pass. As for me, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have, more than any living, but for their sakes that shall make known the interpretation of the king, and that you might know, that you might understand the thoughts of your heart." And so Daniel then tells him, "You in your dream saw a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before you, and the form thereof was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. You watched until a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet, that were of iron and clay, and broke them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind just blew everything away. Then no place was found for any of it. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." And I can only imagine what was going through Nebuchadnezzar's mind about this time, because even though the dream had fled from him, once Daniel described it, it would have all come rolling right back. Yes, that's what I saw. And here is a man who was able to tell me what the dream was. Daniel says, "This is the dream. And I will tell you the interpretation, or tell the interpretation thereof, before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings. For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom and power and strength and glory." All by itself, that is an astonishing statement. For Daniel says, the God of heaven has given you a kingdom and power and strength and glory. This was not something that Nebuchadnezzar had managed to come to entirely on his own. It was because God had decreed that this man would come to power at this point in history and had handed him this kingdom. He was really the first really great world-ruling emperor of his time, at least of the world that anybody knew anything about. What I think is also significant about this is that this history that we are reading of here begins with Nebuchadnezzar, who is the first great Gentile king after the final fall of Israel. It is almost as though up until this time in history was the age of Israel. But with the fall of Judah, with Judah going into captivity in Babylon, now begins the age of Babylon. That seems to be the thrust of the events that we get here. Because, as we will see, this great image that we see, although it's one unified thing from top to bottom, it spans the entire length of time from the day in which Nebuchadnezzar was alive until the return of Christ and the establishment of the kingdom of God. That image encompasses the entirety of the dominant age of the world from one time to another. He goes on to say, wherever all the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven, he has given into your hand, and has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. After you shall arise another kingdom inferior to you, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over the earth. Now, historians have looked at this. I think there's almost total agreement. Not maybe there are a few fringe commentators that are different on it, but the primary thrust of all this is clear. Babylon was succeeded by the Medo-Persian Empire, which was inferior to the Babylonian Empire, gold to silver. The Medo-Persian Empire was finally conquered by Alexander's empire, by the Grecian Empire. They were the belly and thighs of bronze or of brass. And a fourth kingdom shall arise that shall be strong as iron. For as much as iron breaks in pieces and subdues everything, and as iron breaks all these things, so shall it break in pieces and bruise. And whereas you saw the feet, the toes, were part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom will be divided. But there shall be in it of the strength of iron, for as much as you saw the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas you saw the iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. But they shall not cleave to one another, like iron can't mix with clay. So you have a brittle, mixed, kind of a people's kingdom of power at the very end time of all this, because he takes you all the way down, finally out to the toes of this creature. Now, I don't know, Daniel does not make much of the number 10, that there are 10 toes on a normal human body. He doesn't seem to make an issue of that. But it becomes an issue later on. It becomes an issue particularly in the book of Revelation, where this number 10 keeps coming back in relationship to kings which give their power for 1 hour to something called the beast. But that's something that's out there a little further, and right now we're trying to establish the basic, fundamental framework into which all that stuff has to fit. He goes on then to say, in the days of these kings. Now, the way in which that is put, in the days of, implies not the whole period of time, but in a particular narrow slot of time. And so you would say, in the days of these kings, plural, what does this mean? Does he mean in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, Medo-Persian Empire, like Cyrus, Alexander, and of course then of Rome and all the Roman emperors? Is that what he means by that? Or does he mean the kings that are represented by the toes of this great image? You can't tell from the context of Daniel's precisely what he means by that. You just need to take and file that away in your memory for future study, so that whenever you come across things elsewhere in prophecy, you can relate them to this particular passage. In the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Remember what that was back in the vision of the dream? He said, all the stuff was there. He says, and you watched until a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image on its feet that were of iron and clay, and broke them, and carried them away. And the stone, toward the end of verse 35, became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Now, all of us by now have pretty well got down in our minds that this is talking about the kingdom of God. Christ is that stone cut out without hands. Christ is that great cornerstone of God's church. And Christ is the one who returns, smashes this image on its feet. And as a result of that, brings the whole edifice collapsing down in pieces. And it says, this kingdom shall stand forever. So, it's fairly easy to get the picture of what's talked about here, that you have a single image, a unified image, that finally becomes and deteriorates in quality and increases in hardness down through the passage of time and history, until in its hardness it finally becomes brittle and fragile and mingled and yet not bound, to the place where finally at the end a stone smites it on the feet, crushes it, and brings the whole edifice down into nothing. This is the pattern that that Daniel is revealed to Nebuchadnezzar and then to Daniel in the dream of the world history. Really, from that time until the return of Christ and the establishment of the kingdom of God is all in this. Now, what's interesting to me, and I was thinking about this just this morning, if you were a Jew living in the first century, what would you think about Daniel's vision of this kingdom? Would you have seen it any other way from the way in which commentators today see it? With Nebuchadnezzar, with the Medo-Persian Empire, Alexander's empire, followed by the Roman Empire. For these were the dominant world-ruling empires in strict succession down the line. What is more significant, or just as significant, and I don't know that they thought of this, but it is clear, frankly, looking back in history, that the thing that all these kingdoms had in common was their God, was their religion. For the Babylonian religions found their way right through the Medo-Persian religion, right into Greece, and right into Rome, so that the same overall dominant spirit, shall we say angel, or whatever it might be, dominated, or prince, dominated that kingdom from Babylon until the time of the very end. Whatever you may think about that, it is fairly clear that the system is the same system all the way through. Now, when you understand this, you will understand perhaps why it is that the general thrust of most prophetic studies of this take us through Alexander to Rome and ultimately right up into the heartland of Europe. Because that is the path whereby the Roman Empire developed. All the way down to modern times when Adolf Hitler adopted all manner of Roman paraphernalia, methodology, and so forth, imitated the Holy Roman Empires, and in the process was putting together the Third Reich, the Third Kingdom, really the Third Empire that had developed in the center of Europe that was essentially Roman in spirit, thought, attitude, and direction. There's not much question about it if you just simply follow the breadcrumbs right through history to that event. And so, consequently, you have that brittle remaining Roman Empire existing all the way up until finally Christ returns and brings the whole thing crashing into a heap. For as much as you saw that the stone, verse 45, was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay that God had made known to the king, what shall come hereafter, the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof is true. Now, there's something I think that is very important. Let's continue the verse, though. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and worshipped, or did obeisance to Daniel. He bowed to Daniel and commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors to him. And the king answered unto Daniel and said, Of a truth, God is a God of gods, a Lord of lords, and a revealer of secrets, seeing you could reveal this secret. Then the king made Daniel a great man and gave him many gifts, made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and the chief of the governors and the wise men of Babylon. So Daniel requested of the king that he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel sat in the gate of the king. The thing I think that needs to be understood about this, too, as you read through it, that this is not merely a matter of God looking into the future and seeing what is going to happen and revealing it to Nebuchadnezzar. God has decreed that this is going to happen. In other words, basically, He told them, this is the pattern that I am going to work out through these kingdoms right on down to the time of the end. The age of Israel was past. The age of the Gentile kings had come on, and that's the pattern we're going to follow. And it will go through these 4 successive kingdoms that will develop out of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, ending right at the very end time. Now, as I said before, anyone who's going to try to interpret prophecy needs to interpret this vision. They need to understand this vision, and they need to understand and have a grip of the history, the actual history on the ground of how this worked out. Because people keep trying to take this image off into Russia or off into the East or somewhere anywhere except take it right up through Rome and right into the European heartland, which is where history took it. I've said this before, that if you don't understand history, you are not going to be able to interpret biblical prophecy. For Isaiah said, when he talked about this, talking about the gods and challenging them on the question of prophecy and proving that they're gods, he said, let them bring forth, let them show us what's going to happen. Let them show us the former things, what they be, that we may consider them and understand the latter end thereof. Do not have a good foundation laid in history. If they do have it, it's well hidden. And they have certainly not taken the trouble to lay the history out in their writings that they are making about prophecy as we approach the end time. Now, there's some important things to understand, and if you pass on down to the 7th chapter of Daniel, here is another one. This time, Daniel has the vision. There's something about this that has always troubled me just a little bit, and has left me feeling that while we have the basics correct, that there are some things just above the basics that maybe we haven't fully understood as we might have understood them. In Daniel 7, the first year of Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. And he wrote the dream, and he told the sum of the matters. David spoke and said, I saw in my vision in the night, and behold, the four winds of heaven strove upon the great sea. And four great beasts came out from the sea, all different from one another. The first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings. I looked until the wings thereof was plucked, and it was lifted up in the earth, and made to stand on its feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second like a bear, and it raised itself upon one side. Now, before I go any further, I want to stop and try to get one piece of understanding across. There is an area of study to which, frankly, we have given very little thought in years gone by, and a lot of attention needs to be given to it. In fact, not many people who attempt to interpret biblical prophecy have given an awful lot of attention to this. And the topic is, the word for it is iconography, which means basically the study of iconology, the study of icons and the methods in which things were represented in times gone by. Now, the word icon is becoming much more familiar to us in modern times because of computers. All of us use icons. If we use computers, all the computer programs have little icons across the top of the page that you can click on, and you look at them, and because you know the shape of a printer or you know the shape of whatever it is this icon's all about, you can click on it, and it will either save your file, print your file. You can do all kinds of things, and you don't have to be able to read to do that. You can actually just click on a symbol, and away it goes. They use these icons because the icon is small, and they don't have to write out the word printer, up there. They can just put a little bitty image of a printer, sort of halfway looks like a printer at the top of the page. So icons have become familiar to us from computers. Most people don't see them anyway. If you're walking through an airport these days, especially an international airport, this is going to be true. That because you can't depend on what language people speak as they walk through your airport, they use icons for the different things a person might be looking for in the airport. They have a little suitcase up there with an arrow that points you to baggage claim. They have a little image of a man and a little image of a woman. This tells you that there's a men's room, and that tells you there's a woman's room there where the restrooms are. And so on it goes. They have a little circle with the line going across them, and it says, don't go in here. All these things, you can go to Frankfurt, Germany, speaking not a word of Germany, and make your way through the airport fairly well, because the symbols you will see up there, the little icons all over the place, tell you where everything is without reading one word of German. Okay? Well, in the ancient world, not only was there the question of what language people might have spoken, the question, very big question, is whether they could even read at all, and much less be able to read any given language. And so icons were very common, and the symbolism was well known of people of what various and sundry icons, or whatever symbol within a picture even, was going to convey. In fact, even as late as the medieval times, and it was to this day, it's still known. If you are knowledgeable of the symbolism of the icons, you can see a row of statues of 12 men, and probably figure out, because there are 12 and you're in a church, that these are the 12 apostles. But I would defy most of you to figure out which apostle was which out of that line, because none of you ever saw them, right? And neither did the guy who carved those statues. So how does he make, Matthew, and how does he make Mark, and how does he go through making all these different people? Well, the answer is that each one of these men has a small symbol connected with his person. And that if you're knowledgeable, you can look the statue over, you can find that little symbol, say, okay, that's Matthew, okay, that's Mark, and so on it goes down through all the 12 apostles. These are icons. This is how they work. So, when Daniel wrote this, when Daniel saw it and wrote it down, and he made the statement that I saw a great beast that was like a lion with eagle's wings. You know, that is a strange creature, isn't it? The idea of a lion with eagle's wings up its back. The fact of the matter is, though, that if you do archaeology in the ancient world, you're going to see all kinds of different combinations of creatures with, you know, the head of one animal and the body of another, with a lion perhaps with wings on his back, or a bull with wings on his back. Each and every one of these symbols had meaning at the time. Now, the killer for us is, and the hard part of this is, that just as language changes over time, so did the icons. And what an icon might have meant, let's say 1,000 years before Christ, it may no longer have meant 500 years before Christ or 500 years after Christ. It's only by diligent work in archaeology that you can sometimes, not always, find out what a given icon actually meant. Now, you could look at this first beast here and say, well, I saw this beast that was like a lion and it had eagle's wings. Now, I could do a little interpretation for you about the British lion and about the American eagle and say this is a combination of Britain and America, which is, of course, the sons of Joseph in prophecy, and therefore this first beast is a combination of the English-speaking peoples. But that's an example of interpreting something in midair. You just take the symbols as you and I understand them today and try to apply them all the way back at that time, and the chances are awfully good we're going to miss entirely. The fact of the matter is, at that time, the lion was the symbol of Babylon. And so consequently, this particular beast was Babylon. The bear, which follows it, which raised itself up on one side and had 3 ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it, this bear was the Medo-Persian Empire. Not the Russians of today, but the Medo-Persian Empire of that time. And so when it goes, it says then after this, in verse 6, I beheld another like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl, and the beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Now this is really strange, you know, but again, it all means something to the person who knows the icon. You know, the heads symbolize something. I was looking in the encyclopedia this morning under iconography, and there was this 7-headed Buddha. And a Buddha sitting there, and he had 7 heads stacked up, one on top of the other, straight up. You wonder, you know, how do you visualize the 7 heads? Are they, you know, across the shoulders like this? Or in the case of this Buddha, they were stacked straight up, one on top of the other. And, of course, the idea of this is not to be a representation of some form of reality. It is purely symbolic. And if a person knows the symbol, then it conveys meaning to the person that's involved in it. Well, this one is not that difficult because it really follows roughly the sequence that Daniel had in this original vision. Babylon, Medo-Persian Empire, Alexander following that, and Rome following that, which we will come to in just a moment. But the leopard symbolizes Greece. It symbolizes Alexander. And the 4 wings are like a fowl on his back, and the 4 heads is a fairly obvious reference to the 4 generals of Alexander who divided up his kingdom after he died. Then I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth, and it devoured and broke in pieces and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was different from all the other beasts before it, and it had 10 horns. A horn is more or less a symbol of a king. It had 10 kings. The image had 10 toes right at the base of it. And so you start finding these combinations of 7s and 10s, and when you put them all together from Daniel to Revelation, certain patterns begin to emerge. He said, I considered the horns, and there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were the eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. The implication is that this little horn, whatever it is a big mouth character. It has a mouth speaking great things, has a lot to say. Now I watched, he said, until thrones were cast down. And the Ancient of Days did sit, his garment was white as snow, the hair of his head like pure wool, his throne was like the fiery flame, his wheels like a burning fire. This harkens back to Ezekiel's vision, as a matter of fact, and of course seems very clearly to be God. A fiery stream issued forth and came before him. Thousands and thousands ministered unto him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. And the judgment was set, and the books were opened. And I beheld them because of the voice of the great words that this horn spoke, because it really exalted itself. It spoke against God. I beheld until the beast was slain, his body destroyed, and given to the burning flame. Now, if you read much of Revelation, you'll have recollection start coming back about the beast being thrown into the lake of fire at the time of the very end. And this mouth, speaking great things, was thrown in there with it. So the beast and the false prophet were thrown in there. Most people who look at this interpret this beast as the Roman Empire, as that last bit of the Roman Empire, and this little horn as being the false prophet who gives a great deal of power to that beast at the end time. Now, what's fascinating about this, as concerning the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. Now, the reason I say this is interesting is because when you look at the image of Daniel, you tend to think of the thing in a top-to-bottom timeline, don't you? And it's logical, because Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold, and it succeeded down through all those thousands of years of history, centuries and decades and generations, right down through those four kingdoms. As one came on the scene, the other faded from sight. And so you have a linear thing in time. Now, when you come to these four beasts, they seem to be the same four kingdoms, but they seem to be contemporaneous, not linear. If you study it, it's here. Because it says the fourth beast was destroyed along with that little horn, but the other three beasts had their lives prolonged for a season and a time. Now, that's not really easy to follow. But the implications of it is that the dominant system, the Babylonian system, survives whole until the end time. It just suggests that there is a sequence of domination of one part of it to another part of it to another part of it. And one would look around today to try to say, okay, so we are not really looking merely at one dominant power. We're looking at four that exist, all of them at the end time, one of them stronger, the other three of lesser power than the other one. One of them, the beast, that is destroyed and thrown into the lake of fire, along with the false prophet. The others manage to survive that and continue on for a season and a time after it. Who are they? I don't know. But the thing is, one of the reasons we might not know is because that we haven't come to a time where this stuff begins to become apparent to us. Another reason why we don't know is because we may not have thought about it quite this way, in realization that it is not merely a linear kingdom down through time, but that the whole system survives until the return of Christ. And that would tend to agree with the comment that was made by Daniel that the image smashed this in the days of these kings. In that sense, would mean the whole system. In the days of these kings, Christ will return, smash the image on its base, and destroy the whole thing, and the whole thing gets blown away in that vision. So here you have two visions that I think are extremely important. If you're going to understand these things are decreed by God. Now, what that means to me is that God will, at whatever juncture in history it is necessary, make the necessary interventions in history to see to it that this pattern follows through. This is what He has decreed will happen. So that He will see to it. He actually brought Nebuchadnezzar to his throne. He brought Cyrus to his throne and foretold his name before the man was ever born. He brought Alexander into the fore and made him a world ruler, and he brought the Roman Empire into its greatness. What's interesting about Rome is that in its earliest years it was really quite a different place from what it became. It was really one of the greatest kingdoms that ever was on the face of the earth. Because, Pax Romana was a time when the whole world at that time was at peace. It was the peace that was enforced by Rome. And you could travel the roads in the Roman Empire with safety, because, or relative safety, because of the Roman soldiers and because of what they were doing to police the world at that time. Rome, of course, like any other great power, became corrupt over time and became what we later came to see it to be. Now, these visions are all really fascinating, but when you come to the book of Revelation, in that famous 13th chapter of Revelation, you cannot interpret this chapter in midair. You have to relate it to Daniel, and you have to fit all this into that pattern that we've seen before. And it has to fit with the history on the ground that has followed through. We can't take modern meanings of icons and put those modern meanings of icons back on the symbols that we see back there. If you're going to be able to understand the icons, you're going to have to do a lot of digging, folks, through archaeological works and books to find out, what were the symbols that were in use at that time. We have verbal descriptions of things which the people who originally heard these prophecies probably recognized. They probably recognized them. When Daniel saw a leopard with 4 wings on his back, that symbol probably meant something to Daniel at that time, because it was an icon. Just like you go through an airport and see a bag up there, a little icon of a piece of luggage, you say, okay, that's the way to where the bags are, the baggage claim. So Daniel and the others, when they saw some of these symbols, knew what they were pointing at in ways that you and I might easily miss if we're not careful. Well, Revelation, the 13th chapter, is one of those really fascinating scriptures coming up at the end time that everybody wants to know, how is this going to play out? Well, however it's going to play out, it must be like a piece of the puzzle set into Daniel's prophecy. He said, I, Daniel, stood upon the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast. By the way, in both Hebrew and Greek, when you see this word beast, all it basically means is an animal. It's not, has no overtones of a beastly beast or anything of the sort. It's just, I saw an animal rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. Now we have, one would have to assume, based upon Daniel's vision, that this beast rising up out of the sea has to fit somehow in that set of 4 beasts that Daniel saw there, because that is the end time pattern that Daniel's giving us. He said, the beast that I saw was like a leopard, his feet were like the feet of a bear, his mouth as the mouth of a lion, and the dragon gave him his power and his seat and his great authority. Notice the implication. One system with the same icons, the leopard, and the bear, and the lion. Here we are once again with this same system. Now it's presented to us as though not it's 4 beasts rising up, but it's 1 beast rising up with all that power, all of the implications of all those kingdoms, going back to Nebuchadnezzar himself. So he goes on to tell you about this creature. He said it had 7 heads and 10 horns. Now this has variously been interpreted to, the 10 horns meaning, the 10 kings that would be putting their power together right at the time of the end. The 7 heads being the 7 successive resurrections, as it were, of the Roman Empire. And all that makes a certain amount of sense in that you can go back in history and track a lot of that and see that it took place. He said the beast, though, that he saw was given its power and its great authority by the dragon. And we all know from the book of Revelation that the dragon is that old serpent, the devil and Satan. I saw one of his heads, as it were, wounded to death, and the deadly wound was healed, and the whole world wondered after the beast. Now, this is something that apparently God has decreed for the end time. And one would sort of assume that it was, if these heads are successive, that probably it is the last one that is wounded and that deadly wound was healed. I think historically people have pointed to one of the earlier Roman emperors or whatever that would fit this category, but I'm not so sure about that. I think there's a certain logic as you read through here that it would be the last one. The whole world wondered after the beast. And they worshiped the dragon that gave power to the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like the beast? Who can possibly make war with him? So we have now a military power, obviously. And the whole world wondering after this beast. Now, historically, in our tradition of prophetic interpretation, we've tended to look at this thing and say, well, we follow Rome all the way up into Europe. We see Rome in Hitler's attempt to resurrect the Roman Empire. It nearly succeeded, as a matter of fact, and was a very close run thing, a lot closer than most people really realize. When you see that up through there, then we have tended to see that as we approach the time of the end, that everybody's kind of looking to see that 10 nations coming together, and they're looking to see the rising economic power of the beast, and there's sort of an assumption that all the stuff is going to come together in a slow and gradual way. But what if this deadly wound were a complete collapse of what was being built. That as Europe began to build itself into this great colossus that everybody was watching for and looking for and expecting to come into existence out of the Roman Empire, if as it came to that place that it all of a sudden fell into complete and total economic collapse and ruin. You do understand, don't you, that subsequent to World War I, that even though there were very heavy reparations put upon Germany, Germany was recovering. During that period of time, the universities were flourishing, art was flourishing, music was flourishing. Germany was moving ahead, and although they had the terrible burden of reparations upon them, they were making it. It was not the reparations, it was not World War I that wiped out Germany, it was the Great Depression of 1929. It was that destroyed the German economy, led to bread lines, led the people by their millions out of work, and eventually brought Adolf Hitler to power. That what is suggested in Revelation 13, I think, is not a slow developing, growing beast, but a beast that was on its way and was wounded to death, and everybody thought it was finished. But because someone came along and pulled it together, it was healed, and it came back, and everyone stared at this beast in open-mouthed amazement. The whole world wondered at the beast. And they worshiped the beast and the dragon that gave it its power, the supernatural things, whatever they were, that came along. And they said, who can make war with this beast? And there was given him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given him to continue 42 months. Now that's pretty specific. This is a decree of God that at the end time, this one is going to be given this power. It will last for 42 months. He opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven. What in the world is this thing blaspheming God's tabernacle for? And is there one? Apparently there is. At the very end time. Why is he so focused on the Jews? On Jerusalem? On a tabernacle? On a temple, if there should be one? And there does not have to be a temple, by the way. A tabernacle would serve to create a holy place, which is basically what the prophecies are about. It was given to him to make war with the saints and to overcome him. And power was given to him over kindreds and tongues and nations. And there's no way really in this context to be absolutely certain right here whether when he says given power over the holy ones, which is what that means, he means over Christians or over Jews, who are the holy ones, that is the nation of God, of Israel, who might be referred to in those terms. There's no way of knowing, and of course it could also mean both as far as that's concerned. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. If any man has an ear to hear, let him hear. So once again, don't try to interpret the prophecy in midair. Take a look at the history, look at the framework, do the homework, as it were. Get the basics right before you start trying to interpret these prophecies. Personally, I'm pretty well persuaded, although I try to keep an open mind on all these things, that what we're going to see developing is a superpower in Europe, but that economic collapse will come along. And I say economic, I don't see any other kind of collapse that's to bring the chaos necessary for this type of thing to take place. And there will come a point in time when these kings will actually give their power for 1 hour to this beast. They will do so voluntarily. They will do so because it is their only hope of survival. They fear economically. Now, you watch the world around you, and you can see these little things beginning to, little hints of this all the way around the edges, that there's a kind of convergence going on. Whether or not this is the one that will bring it all together or not, no one can possibly say. But, Jesus was very explicit about the end time, about, trying to figure out the day or the hour, and he said, nobody knows that. You can forget about the day or the hour. Blessed is that servant whom his Lord has given him a job, will come back and find him actually doing the job. So that part of our task is clear enough as to what we are supposed to do. But we are supposed to watch and pray. And one of the things I think we need to be very careful about, we need to watch what's going on around us in the world. I am really struck by as I talk with people, interact with people, how little real attention people are paying to what's going on. How little they really grasp of what's happening. I remember a time when, when in our clubs and what have you, one of the things we tried to do in order to keep in touch, we'd have a little quiz every once in a while to find out, with the names, like who is the Chancellor of Germany, who is the Secretary General of the United Nations, what's his name, and just tick off all these things. We all had this as a part of our homework to keep track of what was happening, who's doing what and why they're doing it, the politics that are going on among nations, which form the grist, as it were, of the mill of the fulfillment of these prophecies, which we've been wondering about for all of our lives and have studied and thought about and tried to understand what God is doing. We're going to see some very startling things, I think, happening in the future. And the brittleness of the world economic order ought to be apparent to all of us now, shouldn't it? I mean, if it's not apparent to you, I submit you're not paying attention. The world order right now, the financial world order, is extremely brittle. And it could crack, and the cracks could lead to disaster. People keep talking about this Y2K problem as though it were going to be precipitating some huge problem in this country. Folks, the Y2K problem is a pimple compared to the problem that exists in the overinflated, overextended world markets. The situation is dangerous in the world economy. It's fragile, and in fact, everybody, all the knowledgeable people seem to make it very clear, it's a bubble. And bubbles have a way of breaking. Pay attention. Jesus said, watch. We should be watching. We should be attentive. We should know what's going on around us. Because in such a time as we think not, the Son of Man will come. And some of these things, I do not wish to be a person who cries wolf, and so I'm very careful about many of these things, as you no doubt have noticed in time. But I have a sense that we are in a convergence zone, as it were, right now. That an awful lot of things are beginning to converge, beginning to take shape, that could lead us into some of the events that we read about in the book of Revelation. So watching and praying and staying close to God and paying attention to what's happening in the world at large, I think, is very important. And one final caution: be really careful about writing up detailed prophetic scenarios of what you think is going to happen in the future. I can tell you for sure that the more detail you put in it, the more certain you are to be wrong. Be sure you know what the Bible says. Look at the history. Look at what's happened in the past, and wait for God to grant you understanding of what's about to happen.